Uh, the series that we're working on is one we're calling the Spiritual Renaissance. And basically the thesis that we're working on is that the whole life and the situation of the spirit has changed and we're in a different time.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd like to start with asking you that you've spent 35 years recently in India, and you said that India needs the United States and the United States needs...
Yes. I sometimes think of it in terms of conscious and the unconscious. You know, this spiritual wisdom is in the unconscious in India. They inherit it. It's a tradition, and the children derive it from their parents and so on. And the people in the villages, simple people, they live from the unconscious, a deep awareness of this, well, the Shakti, the power in nature and everything around them. And people who come to India feel this sense of the sacred. It's in all the villages and all these people. But it's in the unconscious, really. And consciously, they're all looking to America, to modern conveniences, to science, technology, and so on. But in their unconscious, they still inherit. But now in America, it's the opposite. They're all into the conscious of technology and science, but they're awakening now to this other dimension, you see, and it's in the conscious now. The conscious Americans are seeking what India has unconsciously there. And I think the two need one another, you see. That's the interesting thing.
You also spoke of America as having a kind of spiritual vitality. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's been very impressive. I've only had 3 months, and I've been living largely very away, you know, from people, but we were visited by many, and everywhere I found this search for God, you know. Well, we are ashram, people come from all over the world, and many from America, and they're all in search of the same thing, you know. They're trying to get out of the limits of this technological civilization, awaken the deeper sense, the deeper self, you see. And wherever you go in America, when I go in America, I meet people at every different levels, but all in search of this. Some are into yoga, or into Zen, or into meditation, or some are doing their own tests and so on. But the search is tremendous, and the vitality, I feel, it's really stimulated me. I didn't expect it at all, but I don't get the same in India. It's the opposite. There, it's there, as I say, in the villages, in the people, but here it's conscious, and you experience it as coming from the conscious mind. I think it's the future is here. It really is.
Well, some people interpret this as kind of uncorseted mysticism or even flaky age kind of religion. But you find it a very genuine search?
I think it's very genuine. Mind you, I make a big distinction between the psychic and the spiritual, you know, and there's a lot of psychic awakening in America, all these near-death experiences and things, and people are having extraordinary psychic experiences on many, many different levels. They can be spurious, you know, and they can be misleading, but they can also be very, very creative. And I feel this, there are many who are moving through the psychic into the genuine spiritual awareness. I make a very important distinction between the psyche and the pneuma, or the Atman. You see, all that belongs to psychology is the psyche, and that in the Indian tradition belongs to Prakriti, to nature. And Purusha, the spirit, is beyond Prakriti, beyond nature. And so this psychic thing is taking place all over the world, actually. The psychic experiences. Near death is a very common one, but there are many, many others. And in India, of course, these powers have always been, they call them siddhis, the psychic powers. And they must be distinguished from the pneuma, the Atman, the spirit, which is beyond phenomena. As long as you're in the world of psychology, you're in the world of phenomena, of things that appear. But when you go beyond the phenomena into the Atman, then it's beyond all, this is the problem, it's beyond word and speech and thought and image, whatever you can say. And yet it's the most real thing in the universe, you see. And that is the experience of the Upanishads, you see. They broke through beyond the physical, beyond the psychic, into this spiritual mystery. How can you know the knower? That was their great thing, you see. How to know the knower. We always know the objects. Immediately you think that you make an object of the knower and so on. You make a god or something. but to get beyond all your images, all your projections, all your concepts, to the unknown mystery, the one. It has no name, but you just have to point to it. And words like Brahman or Atman or Tao, they point to this hidden mystery, you see. And people are awakening to that. That's what I feel, you see. They can't name it very often. And it comes to very simple people in all walks of life. Get an awareness there is something beyond all this, and it just breaks through. And sometimes it's a dramatic breakthrough. I like to mention, it's been very important. I had a stroke in January, and it was very dramatic. A sort of terrific force hit me and knocked me out. Like on the TV, when before the thing comes on, everything is like this. Well, it was exactly like that. And then I managed to struggle onto the bed, and they say I would eat for a week. But when I came round, the mind I'd had a death of the mind. The whole mental consciousness had submerged, and a new consciousness had emerged. And it's Advaitic, it's non-dual. And the ultimate reality is non-dual. The moment you begin to talk, to speak, as we're doing now, you put it into dualistic language. You see spirit and matter and conscious, unconscious, all good and evil. All these are in the psyche, in the conscious, in this mental world, you see. But the ultimate reality is non-dual. It's beyond all these dualities. And when you speak of it, you bring it back to the dualities. That is the problem, you see.
Let me ask you a question about that, because, of course, that's the essence of the mystical tradition of the flight of the alone to the alone, or the flame to the candle, and mystics of all age talked about that. There seems to be a tension between the mystical tradition and especially the prophetic tradition within the Hebrew Christian thing, where we do make judgments, and where in that sense it's dual. We say, thus saith the Lord, do not do that. How when you root yourself in this mystical experience of the oneness of all, how do you still make moral judgments which allow you to get along in the world?
Yes, well, I think you always have to live on the two levels, you see. You have to have this mystic awareness all the time, and then you have to translate it into the language of the mind, of dualities, you see. And to me, the Hebrew prophets, and really the whole biblical revelation, is a translation of the hidden mystery into the language of dualities. And I feel this very strongly, that all this denunciation, this condemning the good, separating good and evil, it's a necessary stage. You have to go through it. But to me, we've got to go beyond all these oppositions in the Bible of good and evil and so on, to this transcendent mystery which is coming through all these dualities. And I had an insight into the crucifixion when I had this experience. The words of Jesus, my God, have you forsaken me, you see. To me, that's the climax of the biblical revelation. Jesus had lost everything. He had lost his disciples, and whole his religion had gone and everything. But his God remained, and he had to let go of God, you see. My God, why have you forsaken me? And at that moment, he transcended all limitations, and total love was there, you see. And that again was my experience. When you go beyond all dualities, you experience total unconditional love. And that is the reality. Mm-hmm. And to me, the last judgment is not judging people, putting them down here and there, sheep and goats or whatever. That's only a symbol, a parable. It's an experience of total unconditional love, which you have to face. And it's very difficult to face. Your ego is so strong, you resist it to the end. But it's more strong than any ego, than anything. So to me, it's unconditional love is the real battle of life.
Well, let me bring you back down to prior to the last judgment.
Sure.
To I guess a very famous interchange in India when early in the Second World War, I guess, when Gandhi so much wanted India to be freed from the British, and he actually hoped that the British would be defeated, and Aurobindo chastised him for this and gave money to the Allied cause, and was criticized by some because he was making moral judgments. How do we get along? Say right now we're facing a crisis in the Mideast where there are people who use force in very cruel ways. How does someone who's interested in the life of the Spirit participate in this very mixed world? And there's this problem in the Bhagavad Gita of making moral judgments that we know ultimately that they are not correct. I mean, a cruel person is cruel because they were treated cruelly.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
But for instance, in the movie Bill and I first did together, we dealt with a man who'd murdered 4 people. You could see the hurt in his life that had caused that, but on the other hand, there had to be moral judgments made. So I wonder how you do that, say, in your everyday life. You must still, in India, have to...
It's a tremendous problem. As I say, you always have to live on these 2 levels. And I think the Bhagavad Gita is trying to teach that, and how you have to accept this level of morality, of the divisions which exist, and face it. But at the same time, you have to relativize it. You must never, we tend to absolutize the right and the wrong. Saddam is wrong and Bush is right, all these things, you see. But always they're relative. And you have to have a judgment that goes beyond the relativities, beyond the dualities, and sees the transcendent. The transcendent doesn't simply destroy all appearances, the phenomenal world. It takes it up into a deeper dimension of being, do you see? And I think the wise man, or the wise woman it often is the person who is able to transcend the dualities. He still sees the dualities, he sees the right and the wrong, they're there, all right, but you get a perspective which goes beyond. Nicholas of Cusa speaks of the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, and that takes place at this Advaitic level. But it's so difficult to express it or to put it into words. And when you're faced with the reality of the present moment, I think it's simply you have to have the capacity to judge from this profound point of view, but it depends. You've got your own limitations. You do the best you can with what knowledge you have, you see. And a president or whatever has simply to use what knowledge and has, but he should have this illumination. And I think Gorbachev has got that, He's got an insight which doesn't come from the ordinary. He was into this new science, his wife particularly. Do you know that?
Who was Gorbachev?
Gorbachev,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he's got an insight which the ordinary politician hasn't got at all. And that's what we need. You have to have your politics and your judgment of the present situation, but there should be an insight beyond it all, which gives you a guidance, you see. And sometimes it may mean you do give up. You see, Jeremiah among the prophets had a time job because Babylonians were invading Jerusalem and so on, and everybody wanted to fight. He said, you've got to give way, they're going to take over, you've got to accept it. That was terribly difficult. But there are situations when you have to surrender everything. And I think, you see, Jesus on the cross really simply let evil take over, you see, totally. All the evil, the hatred, the violence was focused on him, and he's just accepted the whole thing, and then transcended it. Somehow there's a way of...
I guess the other question is, though, are there times when the person doesn't give way but has to fight?
He has to fight. Well, that's where this judgment, it's always a particular situation. In that situation, have I the duty to simply surrender and let go? Or in this concrete situation, must I make resistance? And Gandhi was very much aware of that. In general, he believed in total non-violence, but said there are situations where you may have to use violence. Mm-hmm. And it is a judgment again. In that situation, what have I to do?
In a recent book you wrote, a new vision of reality, Western science, Eastern mysticism, and Christian faith. What is the new part in the vision? What is new in the spiritual vision?
Oh, I think it really comes from the civic revolution, with Frithjof Capra and people, this discovery of the total unity of the whole universe. Everything is interdependent and connected. He speaks of a complicated web of interdependent relationships. And that has changed our vision of the world, really, you see. The old idea of solid objects and space and time and so on is simply gone. And now we have this field of energies, and within that field are these structures, you see. And it's all interconnected, interwoven, the physical and the psychological, you see. You cannot separate the soul and the body any longer. They're interacting all the time. And soul and body, soma and psyche, are interacting with the pneuma, the Atman all the time. There are 3 levels of reality. And we have to attend to each one. The physical has its own laws, you've got to face them. The psychology has its own, you have to understand them. And then the spirit has its own unique insights. And you've got to bring that insight into all these 3 levels, you see.
So, for the last 300 years, we've existed in this situation where there's been a conflict between science and religion. And as I read your autobiography, this was very much the mood of your early life. Has this changed?
Oh, it's completely changed with this new vision of you see. I went to a conference in Bombay, you know, I think it was about 1984, somewhere there, and Capra was there and others, scientists and psychologists from America, with some holy men, Swami Muktananda, the Dalai Lama spoke to their Mother Teresa, to share together, you see. And that's when this new vision really came home to me. I saw that science today has opened up a new understanding of the universe, which is profoundly related to the old cosmic vision of the Chinese and the Indian and so on, you see. So it's an extraordinary moment we're living through. The old science and the old religion is collapsing, you see. And a new science and a new spirituality is emerging, and they're interacting now together. And that's the great hope, you see. And it's taking place in America.
I think very often that when these energies and within the human were so conflicted that we were not allowed to both believe and know, there was this tremendous conflict, and that so much of what we think of as this now spiritual renaissance is coming because that's being healed, and there's a new mood from which we're beginning our quest.
Yeah, there was a big block in religion, you see. You weren't allowed to think really beyond certain limits. And that, in the Catholic Church, that broke down at the Second Vatican Council. Now they're trying to close the gap again, you know. But it's broken through, and you can't stop it any longer. And now we rethink the whole theology. I've been reading a very interesting book. It's an interview a dialogue between Fritjof Capra, brother David Steindl-Rast at Newcomb Alderley, and Thomas Matthews, another there. And they say the new paradigm in science corresponds with a new paradigm in theology. We're rethinking from the very base exactly as they're doing in science. And it's a theology based on experience, just as science bases on the experience of the physical world. New theology based on the experience of the spiritual world, which is everybody's beginning to recognize as a valid mode of human experience, you see. So we're evolving a new theology. But the resistance, of course, both in science and in theology, is from the traditional point of view, is very, very difficult to overcome.
Tell me a little bit about your own spiritual pilgrimage. You know, what Kierkegaard might have called the stages on life's way. What have been the major markers and the major points of change and phases in your own spiritual life? You started it's almost in another century in terms of the feeling at Oxford and that you were there. Could you tell us a little about that and how that changed and why it?
Yes, it was very interesting. You see, the time at Oxford was after the First War, 1925 to 29, I think it was. And there was a great sense of disillusion, disenchantment was the word. The war had sort of broken everything up, and people were very skeptical, you know. And I and my friends came away from Oxford without any sense of a meaning in life, you know. And so we'd go and live in a small cottage in the country, have a garden and some cows, and live a very simple life, and see what life was really about. And it was wonderful. It took less than a year, but we were students of philosophy, of literature largely, and we all read the Bible for the first time as literature, and it simply came home to us, you see, and that changed our lives, all three of us actually. And then when I came out of that, I had to find out to locate it, as it were, and Newman was the person who steered me towards the Catholic Church. He is first of all the apologia, and then the development of Christian doctrine. That was the final stage for me, to see that the kingdom of God of Jesus was a seed which had been planted and had grown through the centuries, you see, and that now the church has the possibility of being the flowering of this movement. It's a movement of growth, of change, you see. So that steered me into the church, and I was very lucky. I found a Benedictine monastery in England, Greenwich Abbey, and it answered all my needs. It was very down to earth. We all earned our own living. There was a farm and carpenter shop and all these things, you know. And then there was a very good library, a study of all different religions and everything, and the constant life of prayer. 7 times a day. The liturgy in Latin with the plain chant was very beautiful, and it impressed you, you know. All the music was such an impression. So for 15 years, I never moved out of there. I was just rooted in this thing. And that sort of consolidated the whole thing. And then now, there's a very interesting, I met a very interesting woman in 1940, Toni Sussman. She was a German, one of Jung's first disciples, a Jungian analyst, and she'd been into all the Oriental tradition. And she had all the books there. She and her husband was a Jew. They came to England under Hitler. And she had a center there for psychotherapy and for meditation. And the whole Eastern world opened up for me. That was in 1940. And from that time on, it became really the guiding force in my life, you see. Until later on, about 10 years later, I met an Indian Benedictine monk who wanted me to come to India, you see. So I was able to get free and to start a small community in India, and everything evolved from there. So those were the stages, you see. First of all, this experience with my friends in the country, then this long period in the monastery with a formation, a very broad formation in Catholicism, but it was very limited, you know. I was pre-Vatican, I accepted the whole thing without any question. And then the call to India and the opening Dante, you see. And to me now, you see, just as the church came out of Israel with Aramaic, Jewish customs, all this stuff, and it moved into the Roman Empire with the Greco-Roman culture. And our church, the Roman Catholic in particular, is the original revelation to Israel translated into the language of Greco-Roman culture. The hierarchy, the sacraments, the theology, the canon law, the whole system, Greco-Roman structure on the basis of this original revelation, you see. And I think we've come to an end. I think that Greco-Roman European culture has reached its end now. It is gradually collapsing. And now we're moving into a global world, and I feel the original biblical revelation has to be translated and expressed in the language of Asia today, particularly of India and China and also, and all this meeting with Oriental thought of Zen and yoga and Vipassana and so on, it's coming to America, of course, is simply this opening up of the Western mind to the transcendent mystery, you see, which has been present in Asia from all this time. And to me, India has this hidden wisdom, you see. And they're bringing it to America in very diverse forms, of course, but there is an authentic to that which we absolutely need. And it's mainly the Upanishads, the Gita as well, but to me now the Upanishads, this man Iswaran, you know, I think he's in San Francisco, he's translated it and given an introduction. And I think that Upanishads are, to me, are the key to wisdom today, you see. Mm-hmm. And when we bring that into our Christian tradition, we've got to interpret the Bible, Christian tradition, in the context now of Advaita, of the Upanishads, of the Vedic tradition. And when that happens, then the new thing will emerge.
I think one of the things that we see is that with the influx of some of these Eastern disciplines where yoga and Zen and meditation have been adopted by a lot of people in the United States.
Yeah.
Many of those interested in that have almost thrown out Christianity.
Yeah.
They don't see what part the
Yeah.
Western spiritual tradition has that you need.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about
Yes.
not the replacing of the Western Christian and Judaic tradition, but what the meeting will take,
Yeah.
what it might look like?
Yeah, well, that is the key to me. You see, many are very confused now. They leave their Christianity, go in, and then they're not really satisfied with Buddhism or Hinduism or whatever.
They're not Eastern. We
They're
can't
not
become
Eastern.
Eastern,
You
Jung
can't
used to
become
say.
it. And many come to our ashram. It's been a very interesting experience. They've gone right out of the church and they're searching in different ways. But when they find the Christian tradition, the Bible and the Eucharist, in the context of this meditation and the Indian tradition, they spontaneously recover their Christian faith. It's been most wonderful, really. The people have come. This is the first time we've been to communion for 28 years, they will say, you know. It has changed their lives. So I think what we have to do really is to recover the Christian mystical tradition. You see, that has been swept under the carpet almost. We've almost lost it, you know. But again, in America, it's being revived. I've met all these people now. Thomas Keating, you know, at Snow Mass, and a wonderful person, Pascaline Koff, was in this East-West Dialogue Board, you know, at Osage Monastery. And then Father Lawrence with the John Main tradition of meditation. And then Beatrice Brutto and her husband, they're wonderful insights. This is a mystical tradition of Christianity which we're recovering, and now we can read St. John and St. Paul and the Bible and the Fathers, see the full mystical meaning in the light of the East. It helps us to see how that is in. And so that when we meet with the Eastern mysticism from the point of view of Christicism, then something whole emerges. And I find, you know, when I talk to people, they're longing to see how they can keep their Christianity in relation with Buddhism and Hinduism. And not so many are able to find how to do it. Beyond.
It's that whole notion of
Yeah.
Renaissance.
Yeah.
You can talk directly to Sam, obviously.
So, yes, you see, to me, the Renaissance, the Reformation, were an extremely important and essential movement to break out of the limitations of the whole medieval world. Mainly, of course, I think the primary thing was the cosmology. You see, the Ptolemaic astronomy was there, and the breakthrough of Kepler and Copernicus changed our vision of the cosmos, you see, and that was a tremendous break. And then the next thing was the, inevitably followed from it, the epistemology, the understanding of human nature and human life. And that's where the limitations came in. You see, Descartes and Bacon and people, and eventually Newton, they created a new theology, a new understanding, but an extremely limited one. And what we should have done was to accept the new cosmology and the new psychology, which was very limited and still in the Catholic Church, but realize that there's a metaphysical and a mystical tradition which they lost sight of, you see. And only now we're recovering the really deep metaphysical and mystical tradition in Christianity. And only with that can we meet Vedanta and Mahayana Buddhism and Taoism and Sufism, all these other doctrines. And when those all come together, you see, then the new age will begin. That's how I see it.
And that's what it's that that holds you within the
That's
Roman
what
Catholic
holds
Church.
me within, you see, the profound mystical tradition from Jesus himself, St. Paul, St. John, the Fathers, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Karl Rahner is the one theologian to me today who's got a mystical insight. He's got all this theory of self-transcendence, beyond your body, beyond your mind. Every human being has a capacity of self-transcendence to open on the divine, infinite, the eternal. It's buried in most people. They don't realize it, but it's coming up, you see, everywhere. People are discovering it. And it's that self-transcendence going beyond. There we meet the mystical tradition in all religions, you see. And that's where we can meet, all can meet together eventually. That's the hope, you see. We're bridging all these gulfs now. That's the thing.
We're trying in this series to speak a great deal who are on a spiritual quest, but don't come to that with any necessary trust in any religious authority of the biblical tradition or anything of the kind. What advice would you have for a person starting off on a quest who does not come with a conviction or a commitment to any particular religious tradition?
Yes, well,
how should they search in
it's
this
very
time?
common to people who come to, I always say you have to follow a guide. Once the awakening takes place, you begin, then you get a guidance, you see, and you meet people, you read books, and you begin to open up, and you must follow the path, your path. Each have their own path. If you're into Zen or to yoga or to whatever it may be, follow. And if you have a Hindu guru or a Buddhist teacher, follow them. But don't think that's the end, you see. You must allow the Spirit to work and open you up and follow your inner guide. We're all coming from all different directions, but we're all being led towards this infinite transcendence, you see, beyond all religions, you see. The ultimate, and it's very traditional in church and elsewhere, God cannot be named, you see. St. Thomas Aquinas said, no one can say, quid est Deus, what is God, you see. It's beyond all your concepts, all your imagination, and we're all being led to this mystery beyond, you see. And if we follow a guide, it will take us through. It's a real spiritual guide in the heart, you know. But you've got to be very faithful. You can be misled here and there all the time. But follow the inner light and it will take you to the ultimate truth. And that's where we all meet in the ultimate.
One of my favorite passages in Thomas Aquinas is where, after he's talked for 13 pages about the names of God, he quotes Dionysius the Areopagite, and he says, but finally we remain as to one unknown.
The one unknown. It's so profound, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And Matthew Fox, you know, is publishing texts of this. St. Thomas is a commentary on Dionysius the Areopagite, which he wrote when he was in the early 20s. At the beginning of his life, he had this tremendous mystical insight. Then he produced the whole Summa and so on. But at the end, of course, he said, all I've written is like straw in comparison to what I've seen. And that is the reality.
Question. You call for a return to the perennial philosophy and to the wisdom that underlies all religions. If we did this, what do you think the social and the political order might begin to look like? How would it change? How would our common life together in the world?
I think the main thing will be what is already happening, you know, in Eastern Europe. It'll be a breakdown of the present divisions, you see. I think that capitalism will collapse just as communism has, you see. And I think there will be a new world order. And it will arise when people from all different directions begin to follow this inner light, to realize where they're being led. And I think we're being led into a polycentric authority, not one dominating.
Polycentric authority.
Yeah, that's the thing, yeah. And in India, it's very interesting. There's no central authority in Hinduism, and yet there's extraordinary unity. There are many centers of holy men from earliest ages, and that holds the whole thing together. But we think you've got to have one man or one group dominating or teaching everybody. But that is on the psychic level, that's still on the inferior. But when you get to the mystical level, you open up on many centers, you see. And you've got to listen to all these different approaches to the one.
You know, it was Nietzsche who said, the center is everywhere.
And the circumference nowhere. That's exactly it. Every human being is a center. You see, and God is, as Eckhart will always say, God is in that person. You see, each one. In that baby just born, God is there. So, So that's where we are.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate very much your speaking
Well,
to
it's
it.
good to be able to share. It's so important. I think I've been so encouraged, you see, to feel that so many people in America are moving in this direction. Christians and others and everywhere. It's happening. So
We think it is a real renaissance.
I do too. But the old thing is hanging on, and it will
Oh,
hang
yes.
on for a long time.
Well, the dragon always does that. Joseph Campbell used to say that the dragons are always guarding treasures and virgins, and they don't know what to do with either one of them.
Very interesting. Yeah. It is the dragon, quite right.
Yes.
Yeah.